Well, it's interesting. Now, the way I've often broken it down for people, and you can tell me whether you agree or disagree, is that among anti-capitalists, among opponents of capitalism, you have three schools of thought. You know, one, you have social democracy.
Yeah.
And that's basically the belief that socialism, or the anti-capitalist social order, the higher society that's more progressive than a society based on greed and profits, will come one step at a time. That gradually, out of the existing social system, you will get the new social system, right?
Yeah.
That, I I saw a cartoon once. It said building socialism one step at a time. It had like a brick wall, and one brick was free healthcare, another brick was end the war in Iraq, another brick was pass the Employee Free Choice Act, and the idea was eventually you get this full wall, and that's socialism. That's social democracy, right? And Edward Bernstein, the Marxist who broke away and started pushing these kind of ideas, he said the movement is everything, the goal is nothing.
Yeah.
That it's the struggle for reforms just leads to socialism. Don't talk about a revolution. There's no event horizon between socialism and capitalism. It's just gradually we're going to get more and more progressive. And Bernstein said, "Oh, look, we have universal male suffrage. We got public education, and gradually,
gradually you'll get."
And that also fed into imperialism, because there's this belief that the West was closer to socialism than the developing world. So when the West was colonizing the developing world, that was making the developing world more like the West. Bringing their more advanced, maybe it's not perfect, but it's closer to socialism than what they have, and so that was social democracy. And then my understanding is Marxism and revolutionary Marxism, Bolshevism, whatnot, said that's wrong. That actually there is a clear line, right? That there is a struggle to seize control of the means of production, the workers to establish a working class government, and they would prefer it to be a peaceful revolution. They prefer a peaceful transition. They're not left adventurers, but people defend themselves, build unions, run for office, but also be aiming to take control of the government, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the ultimate. That was the idea, and then the government will establish, socialism, which is public control of the means of production. Eventually, that'll lead to the ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world. And then my understanding of anarchism rejects political action. It's the idea that you shouldn't run for office, that the focus should be on direct action in the workplace. The focus should be on building your kind of communes and community gardens and your own kind of thing, and that there's a feeling that if you create the classless society with coercion, then it'll be tainted by that from the beginning, and that it needs to that you need to kind of create it in a voluntary way that does not involve coercion. Am I correct about that?
I mean, to a certain extent, there's kind of in my opinion, a slight misunderstanding, and it's an easy one to make. Because anarchism in particular takes a lot to get your head around. It took me years of study and reading and just working it out in my head to actually understand how it's supposed to function. So anarchists primarily reject use of the state. We don't necessarily reject the use of all coercion, all force at all times. Now there are like anarcho-pacifists coming from the Tolstoyan tradition, and they have a very strong argument, in my opinion. But the issue is less that the coercion is used, and more that that there is a giant institution, a police and a military, that is formalized, hierarchical, and used to enact the decisions either of that institution in the case of a military dictatorship, or of a government in the case of a liberal democracy. Anarchists don't so much completely reject electoralism. Like, there are anarchists who will tell you don't vote. I'm not one of them. I think people absolutely should vote. You just shouldn't see that as the only means of engaging politically, and in fact it should probably be the least means of engaging politically. You vote to make things a little bit better incrementally, or at absolute worst you vote for harm reduction.
Yeah.
And you also vote because that's the primary way that somebody is going, like the vast majority of the masses express their politics. So by talking about an election, by talking about a specific law, you can engage people in conversations that they otherwise wouldn't have.
Well, that's a lot like what Lenin says in his book Left-Wing Communism. He makes the same argument. You should participate in elections because that's the only place that people are political, is when it's time to vote in a lot of cases. So if you just abstain, then you're not going to be part of that conversation. For the same reason you should join non-revolutionary labor unions. Was in left-wing communism is the pamphlet by Lenin, very famous, where he makes these arguments, and he tells his followers that are just thrilled by the idea of a violent revolution to actually be sensible.
Yeah.
Yet you also mentioned, and I think this is very interesting, is you mentioned that the peasant classes are particularly interested in it. And I feel like, that three-way breakdown I just did is very Western, because, Peter Kropotkin, he was in Russia, they called them the Narodniks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people say that means populist. I don't like that translation, because populism is something completely different. We understand populism is like rallying the masses and stuff, but in Russia, I mean, it's peopleists, I think, is a better way of interpreting it. And that's what it written. Narodnia is the people or whatever. And the Narodniks were like the first mass anti-capitalist movement in Russia. And it was generally wealthy people, like Peter Kropotkin, who went to the countryside, and they tried to get the peasants to rise up against their landlords, or in some cases to buy little tracts of land on their own and just kind of have cooperatives.
And start the peasant communes.
And it was a big movement, and in fact it was like kind of the gateway drug. Trotsky was a Narodnik for a long time. I think Lenin was associated with the Narodniks at one point. And it was the first major revolutionary movement in Russia. And unfortunately, it was just largely not successful. And then after that, you had the terrorists, and that was actually what they were called, hilariously. And their idea was that they were going to, engage in acts of violence. A couple of czars were assassinated. Lenin's brother was a terrorist, actually, was hanged for it. And the terrorists were unsuccessful. And Marxism came to Russia as the third revolutionary movement. It said it was actually the factory workers. And that they were the ones that would make the revolution. And it was first, Plekhanov, and then eventually, Lenin and all of that. So, but that focus on the peasant class, that seemed to be the difference in Russia. It wasn't so much about whether you wanted to have a state or should we run for office. It was more about, are we going to make the revolution with the peasants, or
are we going to make the revolution with the factory workers?
Yeah, and that seemed to be the difference. And the interesting thing is Mao, right, was an anarchist. He was a Kropotkinist until the Russian Revolution, right? That his followers, they were in something called the New People's Study Group, it was called. And that was what they were called.
No. I love that they call it the study group, because my Buddhist organization, we have our study group. That's funny. Like week to week.
Yeah, but if you read, there's any biography of Mao will tell you that Mao was this university librarian, and for a while he was an elementary school principal, and he was just this guy, and he was always organizing this New People's Study Group, and to be in it, you had to abstain from sex, right? And that was one of their rules. They were like monks, basically. And then on top of that, they studied Peter Kropotkin, and they were in study with the Narodniks, and they were fascinated by all that. And it wasn't until the Russian Revolution of 1917 that really anybody in China had any interest in Marxism, because there weren't very many factory workers in China.
Yeah, right? It was largely agrarian.
Yeah, and so there was this feeling we're an agrarian society, and the literature of Peter Kropotkin and anarchism spoke to the Chinese people, whereas the literature of Marxism didn't really speak to people. But then when the Soviet Union emerged, that was a country they could get inspiration from, and things changed. I think that's particularly interesting. And then many people will point out that what Mao did later, in the People's War, or whatever you want to call it, was very, Kropotkinist. He was in the countryside, seizing liberated territory, organizing the peasants, redistributing land, forming these associations of peasants, and it was very much a peasant revolution. And people argue that if Mao had been in Russia, the politics he was espousing, even in the 30s and 40s, up into the 50s, were not, Bolshevik politics. He was espousing something more in line with anarchism. And I think that's interesting, and that will the peasants make the revolution, or will the factory worker make the revolution? That seems to be the difference. And when I think of that, I don't think of peasants as wanting complete anarchy. And I don't think of factory workers as wanting a very authoritarian... it's weird that becomes the connotation, but that's very much outside the developing world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And it's very interesting, actually, because I recently was looking into my lineage, and I actually come from literal peasant stock in the Carpathian Mountains.
We all do. I mean, right? I mean, yeah. Unless you got noble blood in you. I mean, I'm sure, I'm Irish, and I'm sure my ancestors were peasantry. You know what I mean? It's like, I think we're all descended from peasants in a way, right? I mean,
yeah, I would say absolutely. I mean, it's something like with Toba catastrophe theory, all humans on Earth are descended from I think 2,000 or so individuals.
Wow.
After the Toba volcano exploded. That's why we have one of the smallest we have the least genetic diversity of many species on the planet. So we do all come from a very common background, and I think that is, one of the things that really speaks to me about socialism.
Yeah.
If it's anarchist socialism or Marxist socialism, what's his face? Che Guevara very famously said that a revolutionary is motivated by great feelings of love. And I think that's very true from the left. I think a lot of what we are aiming for, whether you're a Marxist or an anarchist or a social democrat or democratic socialist, it's the idea that people are equal, that human life is inherently valuable, and from the highest to the low, there really shouldn't be any distinction. I mean, you even saw that like with the Diggers during the English Civil War.
Well, and that raises another point, which is that, prior to the rise of Marxism and the labor movement and all of that, there was a trend of like the peasant wars in Germany, the Diggers in Britain, and of peasants rising up against the nobility, but not creating kind of a higher system, right?
Yeah.
And that this has been pointed out. In fact, one of the thinkers that I draw a lot from is this guy Nelson Peary.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about how all through feudalism, there were many instances of peasants rising up and overthrowing the landlords, redistributing the land, or having peasant communes for 100 years sometimes, But eventually, feudalism would retake it, because feudalism is a much more efficient way of running an agrarian, economy. And it wasn't until the development of capitalism that you had a new mode of production that feudalism could fully be overturned because you had something more efficient.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's part of it. The other aspects with it are, of course, military. Feudalism came about after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And it came about as part of actually an economic crisis, because the Roman dinar suddenly became worthless, and so people were trading in fealty and plowshares and that kind of thing. Another big aspect to the development from feudalism to capitalism and the creation of the modern nation state was the advent of the cannon. Suddenly castles weren't able to protect you anymore, and so what you had was nations either voluntarily joining together or being conquered by other nations. It was the ability to extract a large tax base that allowed you to field and feed large armies and arm them with the latest technology. And that's kind of that military aspect is sort of like what undergirds the liberal democracies that we live in now. It undergirds the state. And, anarchists, again, tend to have a lot of issues with the state. For instance, there's government, like the actual elected, and, some of them, a lot of them are terrible, but the actual ability to govern, the ability to sit down and create and mediate policy, that is not necessarily something that anarchists object to.
Mm-hmm.
What we object to is the hierarchical force behind it, because once you have a giant military apparatus that can be commanded by just a few people, it's only natural that apparatus will be subverted for the protection of its most valued citizens, which are the people who have the most money, who have the most property, and suddenly we find a system that is on its face supposed to work for everybody actually winds up working for the 1%. Which is what we were talking about at Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah, well, in his book on the state, that is like the book by Lenin that everybody reads, The State and Revolution, Lenin defines the state as a body of armed men.
Mm-hmm.
He says the state is a body of armed men, right? And that body of armed men has a monopoly on legitimate armed force. Other people, the state is allowed to shoot people. You're not allowed to shoot people. It's and that's really, that brute force, a body of armed men who have a legitimate monopoly force. That is the nature of the state. And the state really originated with the origin of private property. And that when private property came into existence, it became necessary to have a vehicle to protect the private property of those who owned it.
And we should clarify here for your audience. I don't know how much of mine, I know I've got some ANCAPs that listen to me. So when we're talking about private property here also, we're not talking about personal possessions. We're not talking about the books back here. We're not talking about about Caleb's home. Or the computer or your iPhone or whatever. What we're talking about is absentee property, the ability to own something that you do not possess. In the absence of a state, you can own and control maybe one or two houses by your presence. So you've got the house that you live in maybe, and then you have a cabin somewhere that you lock. And even that can become difficult to control, assuming, you're gone most of the time. Somebody comes in, breaks in the lock, and decides to start living there. Now, in the event of large companies like with Amazon, Amazon is Jeff Bezos's private property. He does not possess Amazon. He may never even set foot in the door of like any of his warehouses. But if at one point the workers say, you know what, we don't want to give Jeff Bezos money anymore. We don't like the way he's running things. So we're just going to keep doing things. And Jeff, you can just be mad about it. There would be very little that Jeff Bezos could do without the state to back up his property claim. So when we talk about private property, we're talking about the physical ability to own and control things that you do not possess under your own power and do not use yourself, and someone else uses them on your behalf. Another way to explain it might be personal empire. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about private property.
Well, the way I've always explained the difference between personal property and private property is things that you use are your personal property. Things that you do not use for any other purpose than to make money are your private property, right? Like you said with Amazon and all of that. I mean, McDonald's, those stores don't exist because, the Kroc family wants a place to hang out and eat hamburgers, right? I mean, they use it only to make money, right? And that's the difference, right? And that, a house, a boat, a car, whatever, a book, a computer, that's something you use for yourself, for your personal pleasure, to do your work, something like that. But it's not something that just, you have a piece of paper that says it's yours and therefore you make money off of it. I think that's the distinction.